Welcome back to our video series, Mindfulness, where Dharma meets practice. The topic of this fifth video is living in the midst. Living in mindfulness, we tend to lose me in the task at hand. Living in virtue, to the extent we attain purity, we lose me in concern for the well-being of all. Living in wisdom, me disappears into nature. Living in devotion, we lose me into the practice of Dharma itself. But how do we not lose mindfulness, virtue, wisdom, and devotion in the midst of the chaos and contingencies of normal worldly life? Setting out on the Buddhist path is like taking a hike with a large and very mixed group of people of every age, state of health, type of footwear, backpack size, degree of inebriation, and so on. Such a group will spread out along the path. The strongest, healthiest, hiking booted, light backpack, boldest, most persistent, and most enterprising will lead the way. In the middle, there might be a mutually infatuated teenage couple that keeps up in spurts, but they keep getting sidetracked and disappearing from the path and then returning with ruffled hair. Some chubby middle-aged people will huff and puff their way into this middle group, along with some fit but ancient bird watchers. Falling way back are parents and their little kids who cannot walk another step, a couple of people sitting on a rock drinking beer, an elderly gentleman watching fire ants devour his cane, and a lady who broke a heel upon encountering her first rock. Similarly, Buddhists, all intent on losing themselves in nature, come with different levels of enthusiasm, aptitude, opportunity, and bring with them different forms of worldly baggage. They also choose among different forms of practice, oftentimes inspired by the accomplishments of the leaders and tales of views from lofty heights. At the beginning of the path are those who add a practice or two piecemeal into already busy lives. This is where most of us start when we first come to Buddhism. At the higher end of the path are those whose entire lives are practice, for the depth of the Dharma comprehends all aspects of life. This last group is held as an ideal necessary to reach the loftiest heights of awakening. This video is concerned with how we move as far up the path as possible in the midst of our busy lives. That is, it provides some suggestions for how we view, plan, and arrange our lives to provide the optimal conditions for the Buddhist in us to grow and flourish with time. As we start out, we typically add a Buddhist practice or two to our busy lives, to the externals, that is, to all of our non-Buddhist responsibilities, values, pursuits, and so on. We generally leave the externals intact. Typically, modern and valid ways to enter Buddhist practice are through mindfulness-based meditation, through devotional practices, and through reading inspirational texts. Each of these specialized practices quickly provides an inspiring sense of bright and sunny satisfaction and calm, encourages further practice, is rather modular in relation to externals, and demands moderate time and effort. However, this kind of specialized practice has severe limitations for a couple of reasons. First, we have learned that everything we do throughout the day even if we do not consider it to be particularly Buddhist, even if we do not consider ourselves to be particularly Buddhist, bears on practice, either as right practice or as wrong practice, whether we are aware of it or not. Remember that we are the heirs of our karma, all of our deeds. Second, each of these practices is fundamentally a support for the rest of Dharma practice. Mindfulness, for instance, is a powerful, multi-purpose faculty whose full power comes from how it is applied. Certainly, we can't really fulfill the practice of mindfulness except in service of ethics, right understanding, and refuge, which are often somewhat neglected in single-minded meditation practice. Mindfulness without Dharma develops as a powerful all-purpose faculty, but with limited content to be mindful of. The result of this dedication to a single practice is that practice mixes poorly with the externals of life, and practitioners find themselves thrashing between two modes of being. One of these is rife with stress, striving, and conflict, and the other is calm, uplifting, and affords temporary relief from the other mode of life. The practitioner begins to view meditation as a lifeline to something sane in her life and develops a strong attachment to the chosen means of practice, all the while frustrated with overall progress. This is much like the knitter of the first video who watches his partially finished sweater unravel through most of the day. Attachment is dangerous. It can easily lead to dogmatic and self-involved adherence to one's chosen practice as true Buddhism. In fact, whole schools of Buddhism have developed around such narrow understandings of both meditation and devotional practices. Mindfulness-based meditation, for instance, is often touted as a complete path in itself that leads with no additional effort to stronger ethical behavior, better relations, greater wisdom, happiness, and eventually awakening, all possible in the midst of a busy life. Although this single practice provides many benefits and turns quickly to trust and devotion, I've yet to see in others and in myself the more profound behavioral shifts generally promised, even in the most dedicated practitioners, without significant changes to other aspects of the meditator's life. We are likely to begin focused on a single practice, but it's important not to set limits on our practice. We need to maintain a more inclusive view of practice and, where possible, to try and expand the scope of our practice outward, even if we remain centered on a single practice. The rest of this talk is about overcoming limits in a practical way in order to integrate practice more thoroughly into our lives. Even in the midst of the externals, we can bring a wide swath of our lives into closer alignment with Buddhist practice and understanding so that we might progress more rapidly toward awakening. Both mindfulness and devotion are kinds of infrastructure, meaning that, like a road or like the internet, their purpose is in the content they convey, and this content may or may not be in line with Buddhist practice. Mindfulness can be brought to bear on the most mundane tasks throughout the day: preparing meals, repairing the car, caring for children, walking to the mailbox. Simply knowing what your task is, keeping your mind there, and doing it completely not only trains our faculty of general mindfulness, but facilitates a satisfaction, depth of experience, and proficiency that otherwise remains elusive in everyday life. It also requires no additional time commitment. Our on-the-cushion practice greatly develops our capacity for retaining mindfulness throughout the day, no matter what we are doing. A sense of general uprightness gives this a Buddhist flavor, if we keep in mind, in the meantime, the values enumerated in right intention: renunciation, kindness, and harmlessness, as guides to all of our daily activities. We'll further consider devotion in similar terms a little later. Everyone would like a unifying philosophy of life. Without one, we feel fragmented and aimless, unable to go beyond living to satisfy self-serving urges. Unfortunately, we tend to put unnatural limits on what is acceptable to us in Buddhist practice. This is hardly surprising, since entering the Buddha way is, particularly for the modern person, to enter an unfamiliar land with unfamiliar customs and ways of looking at things. There are many teachings of early Buddhism still alive in Asian traditions that raise more than a few eyebrows. For instance, rebirth ritual, the monastic institution, awakening, transcendence of samsara, the language of heavenly realms, and renunciation. Understanding the value of these teachings requires a wide open mind and often a willingness to reconsider our own tacit presuppositions. These are always artifacts of our own culture that we often don't know we have. Sometimes what we attribute to common sense actually has complex origins in the history of Western thought, in Protestant Christianity, in the European Enlightenment, in European Romanticism, in modern consumer culture, that have limited alternative ways of thinking. In fact, there's a strong tendency for modern Buddhists, when they encounter a novel teaching, simply to attribute it to Asian cultural baggage, therefore dismissing it from the purview of Dharma. This strategy is problematic because, as we have seen, for the Buddha, each teaching serves some function that reveals itself in how we practice, and therefore our practice may be rendered critically incomplete if we unwittingly leave something out. We should hope that we could rather let Buddhism be Buddhism and try to comprehend the system as a whole, so that our holistic perspective is not compromised. The problem here has an analogy in anthropology, in which the challenge is to analyze an exotic culture in its own terms without pretentiously imposing our own modern values and interpretations from the outset. The method applied there entails withholding one's own views about whatever inscrutable elements emerge, a process sometimes called bracketing. Bracketing is somehow what I did spontaneously when I first took rebirth seriously, as described 2 talks ago. Even rebirth makes no sense to us. Even if rebirth makes no sense to us, we can nevertheless continue to explore how it relates to other aspects of Dharma and may be a support for practice. We can try to understand better the cultural context in which it does make sense and understand the influence of our own tacit assumptions according to which it does not make sense. This gives us a lot of wiggle room for eventually integrating this teaching seriously. How we ultimately understand the teaching may never be the same as an ancient Indian understanding, but it can still serve much the same function. It's always helpful to ask from the beginning, why did the Buddha teach this? Before we ask, is this true? In this way, we start from the perspective of Dharma rather than from that of our own preconceptions, and sustain a curious, questioning mind. This is what working assumptions are all about. As we bracket aspects of Dharma, we should keep in mind the point made with regard to taking seriously but holding loosely. Our concern is not to be able to say only this is true, anything else is worthless. Rather, it is to practice skillfully, that is, beneficially. Now, it also turns out that we are all quite adept at bracketing. We do this all the time. Let's call a tightly held assumption or belief a viewpoint, and call an outlook that which informs our actual behavior as a basis of our everyday decisions. We all routinely hold both, even when they clearly contradict one another. For instance, a Skinnerian behavioral psychologist might believe, this is his viewpoint, in the lab or in the classroom that human mental states are not real. But he shouts out encouraging motivational words, this is his outlook, to his teenage son as he plays on the school football team, or consoles his little daughter after the dog slurps up her pizza. Another example, you might sincerely believe that physical death is the end of consciousness. This would be your viewpoint. And yet you treat the remains of your newly deceased loved ones with great care and respect, having their rotting remains arranged to produce a pretense of peace and comfort. This is your outlook. Somehow it's helpful. Another example. Many believe that the universe is entirely material, simply playing itself out mechanically and deterministically. This is your viewpoint. Still, none of us knows how to live in such a world. As Isaac Bashevis Singer put it, you have to believe in free will. You have no choice. Free will is a universal outlook, even for those of entirely contrary viewpoints. Actually, I think probably fully awakened people lose this outlook, but we're not there yet. Another example, how many viewers talk to your dog or cat? This is an outlook. How much do you think they understand? This is a viewpoint. I personally even talk to squirrels, frogs, and bugs. Somehow it helps. Another example, there's physically nothing more to money than ones and zeros in computer memory or markings on pieces of paper or metal. This is a viewpoint. And yet we behave as if it is something of substantial value. This is our outlook. And count on others to do the same with remarkable practical results. In brief, loosen up. What is surprising about Buddhism is how thin metaphysical assumptions actually are in the early Buddhist texts. Our presuppositions will be challenged repeatedly, but not so much by contrary Buddhist viewpoints as by the Buddha's record of undermining all viewpoints as illusory and empty of substance. What we do for a living is likely to be particularly significant in influencing our practice. For instance, if we interact with customers for a living, we may be required as a condition of employment to stretch the truth a bit. That dress looks great on you. Or to cook the books, to set up mouse traps, and so on. Right livelihood is the fifth factor of the Noble Eightfold Path. For most of us, livelihood is the central extra Buddhist obligation of our lives. We obligate ourselves to fulfilling a livelihood in order to sustain our lifestyle, to feed our family, or to be able to afford opera tickets, fine cuisine, and a luxury car, or to pay off a student debt, or to realize other values or pursuits. The Buddha warns us to beware. A lay follower should not engage in 5 types of business. Which 5? Business in weapons, business in human beings, business in meat, business in intoxicants, and business in poison. Elsewhere he recommends, and what, monks, is a wrong mode of livelihood? Trickery, cajolery, insinuating, dissembling, rapacity for gain upon gain. These sound embarrassingly like modern job descriptions. I myself used to be employed in research and development under U.S. Defense Department contracts. When I took up Buddhist practice and study, I saw I was probably contributing to weapons systems, and this ended up being a major factor for me in ending my high-paid, high-tech corporate career in favor of what I do now. Unfortunately, the modern economy often offers few wholesome choices for the job hunter living under normal constraints. The radical redirecting of my own career path would have been extremely difficult if I were not at a point in life in which my family obligations were loosening up. If I wasn't designing weapons systems, I might have been working in marketing, trying to convince the public that ingesting some horrid concoction of petrochemicals, high fructose corn syrup, and saturated fats will add zest to their lives. Alarmingly, large modern enterprises typically distribute decisions in such a way that obscure personal ethical responsibility, and workers who are compensated through wages have little control over the product of their labor. A wrong livelihood is one that obligates us to unethical or other behaviors inconsistent with Dharma, particularly by breaking precepts, killing, stealing, lying, and so on. This raises 2 important questions. First, if our livelihood requires that we kill, for instance, are we really the ones harming others? And second, do we suffer karmic results? That is, does this impair the well-being and development of our minds? After all, the killing is our boss's decision, and if we were not there to act out his orders, wouldn't somebody else be called upon to do it instead? The Buddhist answer is much like the decisions of the Nuremberg trial. We are not off the hook. Orders are not just orders. We are the heir of our own deeds. In a recent documentary on the health insurance industry in America, a young woman was interviewed whose job it was to deny insurance policies for pre-existing conditions. She was clearly upset, almost in tears. And she said, when someone comes in, I don't want to be friendly. I don't want to know them. I try just to look at their application. Now imagine how that will bend her character over 5, 10, 15, 30 years. Her livelihood was plainly taking a karmic toll on her already. That is what makes wrong livelihood a detriment to practice. This raises also the question of motivation in livelihood, aside from the paycheck. Some people love their livelihood to the extent that they would engage in its activities even with no pay, as long as they had the time. Some scientists or historians are like this, some artists or actors, many craftspeople and horse breeders. These people are lucky because they inhabit their livelihood. That is, they engage in their life's work devoutly for the sake of their life's work itself, and not as a way, or only incidentally as a way, of getting something else out of it. This is healthier from the Buddhist perspective, as we've seen, because greed and fear and its associated factors like ego involvement are minimized. Moreover, such people are likely mindful of standards and very proficient and enjoy satisfaction and well-being in their work. They are also likely to be quite successful without the distraction of striving for external goals. It's noteworthy that the Buddha, in advising lay people concerning livelihood, repeatedly puts emphasis on the way we inhabit our work, on carrying it out in an upright, responsible, and harmless way, on diligence, on proficiency, and on protecting the results of our labor. All this rather than getting rich. In the Mangala Sutta, the Blessings Discourse, he extols much learning and handicraft as among the highest blessings. Elsewhere, he also states, "What is the accomplishment of persistent effort? Herein, by whatever activity a householder earns his living, whether by farming, by trading, by rearing cattle, by archery, by service under the king, or by any other kind of craft, at that he becomes skillful and is not lazy. He is endowed with the power of discernment as to the proper ways and means. He's able to carry out and allocate duties. This is called the accomplishment of persistent effort." This is to work mindfully and put aside striving. Unfortunately, many of us find little satisfaction in our livelihoods beyond pay. We're kept in a relentless state of insecurity, either because we do not earn enough to support ourselves or our families, or because we are under constant threat of being fired or otherwise exploited. Even rich people can feel that they are in a perpetual state of desperation when their wealth is threatened or fails to support their status. Such desperation is experienced as poverty, even in the midst of splendor. It is also ethically compromising because it makes greed, aversion, and delusion a matter of daily necessity. Such a condition provides little basis for spiritual progress. That so many are forced to live under such conditions is a strong indictment about the health of our society. In a favorite story from the suttas, an older monk was often heard by other monks to exclaim, "What bliss, what bliss!" Since he, as a layman, used to be a king, they didn't think that he was enjoying the delights of the renunciate life, but rather that he was reminiscing about his previous cushy life. Upon word of this, the Buddha summoned the monk and discovered that the monks were underestimating his level of attainment. This was his account. "Before, when I was a householder, maintaining the bliss of kingship, I had guards posted within and without the royal apartments, within and without the city, within and without the countryside. But even though I was thus guarded, thus protected, I dwelt in fear, agitated, distrustful, and afraid. But now, on going alone to a forest, to the foot of a tree, or to an empty dwelling, I dwell without fear, unagitated, confident, and unafraid, unconcerned, unruffled, my wants satisfied, with my mind like a wild deer. This is the meaning I have in mind when I repeatedly exclaim, "What bliss, what bliss!" What this simple monk had left behind is not so different from the lives of many of us, with an asset-laden personal footprint protected by high-tech security systems and a financial advisor. More to the point, reducing our personal footprint or that of our families is one way to reduce the desperation we may feel about livelihood, as we thereby broaden our employment options. Part of what makes simplicity possible is also to be humble enough to let go of our ego involvement or identification with income or profession. This is what this venerable monk clearly had done. Simplicity also means more time for practice or for other wholesome pursuits. More generally, simplicity benefits Buddhist practice because it means renouncing much of what, through our attachments, causes us suffering. Still, at any given time, our attachments may not be negotiable. A group of rather lively lay people once approached the Buddha to ask for spiritual guidance, but made clear that certain comforts and responsibilities were not up for discussion. "We, Lord, are laymen who enjoy worldly pleasure. We lead a life encumbered by wife and children. We use sandalwood of Kasi. We deck ourselves with garlands, perfumes, and unguents. We use gold and silver. To those like us, O Lord, let the Exalted One preach the Dharma, teach those things that lead to weal and happiness in this life and to weal and happiness in future life." Modern people's list of comforts might similarly include a widescreen TV, financial success, designer clothing, and great hair, wild parties, fast women and fast cars, and abundant thumbs up for our social media posts. It's significant that the Buddha does not dismiss the lively group as unworthy of his teaching, but respects that they have made certain choices about the shape of their lives, and so takes what they have said as the parameters within which Buddhist lives can nonetheless take root. How we live our lives is our choice. In the future, we may make other choices. Certainly, family is a central point of attachment in most lives. As we survey our lives, many attachments will be relatively wholesome from a dharmic perspective, others quite unskillful and prone to harm and unhappiness. We should give special attention to letting go of our less skillful attachments. For instance, an amateur hunter might trade rifle for binoculars and then instead take up bird watching. Moreover, contemplating our situation, we're likely to discover that many once seemingly pleasurable pursuits are the most painful and problematic in our lives. That popularity or endless partying or sexual intrigue does not bring anything like lasting happiness. Quite the contrary. This investigation can and should go on for many years by being mindful of the Dharma even as we continue to step over its boundaries. Over time, our attachments may drop away like kids' toys from new teenagers. Buddhist wisdom reveals that there is little worth keeping. The burden, attachment, and enmeshment in samsaric existence they entail are just too dear a price to pay. It is mindfulness of such wisdom that brings our lives slowly into greater alignment with Buddhist principles. Simplicity is making our personal footprint, the domain of our own affairs, what we choose to have a personal stake in, as small as we possibly can. Everything we've brought into our lives has come at a cost to our well-being. Like a well-run corporation, we tend to externalize costs in our own minds. We see only the attractive side of things, even while we and others bear the hidden costs. But simplicity will turn out to be a welcome relief as we let go of things like long commutes, debt, chauffeuring of adolescence, the constant ringing of the phone, bills, nagging neighbors, the threat of lawsuits, divorce, and keeping up with never-ending housework or with the Joneses. It will free up time and obligations in our lives and give us more freedom to shape our lives as we see fit. We can at least be devoted to what we don't simplify out of our lives. We've seen the importance of devotion to the Triple Gem as the prime, wholesome, selfless motivator of Buddhist practice. Devotion is something we can simply develop for many external pursuits in our lives as well: marriage, career, education, hobbies, music, political activism. Devotion turns any such pursuit away from unskillful striving, instead directing us towards selflessness, mindfulness, proficiency, and satisfaction. Interestingly, what we call hobbies are almost always, but usually implicitly, topics of great devotion: surfing, knitting, bird watching, football, collecting string, bowling, karate. It seems to me connoisseurs, epicures, and gastronomes are people who bring an element of devotion into what would otherwise be pure self-serving striving for sensual satisfaction, turning, for instance, the guzzler into a discriminating sipper of fine wines and the glutton into the gourmet. This may be how elites make life more bearable, but it only works if they don't become snobs. The absence of practical purpose beyond the activity itself explains both why other people may view our hobbies as pointless and connoisseurs as silly, but also why our hobbies provide quite palpable and welcome relief from the relentless drive for personal advantage with which we tend to be afflicted during most of our day. It's noteworthy that such secular areas of devotion are typically accompanied by a sometimes religious level of ritual. Consider, for instance, how much ritual is observed at a gourmet restaurant in simply opening a bottle of fine wine. We can never entirely eliminate striving toward goals from our lives. How would we become educated, build a career, or even become awakened? Luckily, we can often moderate our goal-oriented mentally quite easily in favor of wholesome, selfless motivations without substantially changing the outer form of the pursuit nor sacrificing the goal, but in a way that benefits our practice and well-being. Often this is simply a matter of how we frame our goal. It's amazing that this actually works. For example, dieting. Most typically, one diets with the explicit goal of a sexier, slimmer, 20 pounds lighter me on the beach next summer. This goal is achieved by keeping eyes on the prize while undergoing starvation and exercise, a process that provides little satisfaction in itself. As any dieter knows, there is a lot of emoting and suffering in the process, constantly weighing oneself, continually prodded by shame and longing for the end result. Moreover, when the goal is reached, satisfaction is short-lived, because now one must, by the same means, maintain one's sexier, slimmer, healthier me for the following summer. Alternatively, one might instead frame the same pursuit in terms of a simple health standard to bear in mind, which is to say, living an appropriate lifestyle with daily nutritional intake and bodily activity optimized for one's body type. The standard never lies in the future, but is achieved each day or even each moment. In case of lapse, one acknowledges it and determines to do better the next day. There is mindfulness and effort involved, but no striving or emoting. In fact, as one inhabits the practice, one is very likely to become an expert on nutrition, on exercise, and on the other real needs of the human body, and gain enthusiasm for the process. This is in lieu of standing on the scale each day and emoting accordingly. One finds satisfaction in the process itself. One becomes devoted to this aspect of health and joyful. As an extra benefit, one attains with ease the goal one gave up in the first place. Devotion also applies to our larger pursuits in life as well, such as education, marriage, and child rearing, much as it does to Buddhist practice. Do we go to college to study what we can turn into a lucrative profession, like business management, medicine, law, or electrical engineering? Or do we go to college to study what we really love? Not that we can't love the foregoing. Like medieval French poetry, theoretical linguistics, existentialist philosophy, or Buddhist studies. Pursuing these beloved subjects is likely to seem foolish to others, particularly to one's parents. But the deeper level of proficiency achieved in doing so might end up surprising everybody. Joseph Campbell is said to have written somewhere, "I say, follow your bliss and don't be afraid, and doors will open where you didn't know they were going to be. If you follow your bliss, doors will open for you that wouldn't have opened for anyone else." I can report that my life bears this out. My bliss in graduate school was theoretical linguistics, not because I was following Campbell's sage advice, but because I've always been foolhardy by nature. Sure enough, trained in a field where employment is the remotest possibility, doors did open up, one by one, that I never would have expected. Where they ended up leading me has come as a complete surprise, and I'm not aware that that particular series of doors has ever opened for anyone else. Similarly, marriage can be a means to an end or a meaningful end in itself. Does the marriage serve us, or do we serve the marriage? With insufficient devotion, it might be a means to sex, social prestige, housekeeping, childcare, and meal preparation, or to material comfort, security, and luxury. Seeking personal advantage in this way is always a source of suffering and a hindrance to spiritual development. Also, the marriage is easily abandoned in favor of trading up to a more promising partner. With devotion, on the other hand, marriage is a refuge, likely pursued mindfully, with sensitivity and deeply, as a source of personal satisfaction, intimacy, and meaning. We see that devotion to even extra Buddhist pursuits resonates well with the Buddhist path in that it leads to a purer mind and is not so different from the devotion we bring to Buddhist practice. On the other hand, striving for personal advantage can easily infect both secular and religious domains. Many of us, particularly in the beginning years of Buddhist practice, show great pride, compare ourselves to others, excel in debate, and boast great attainments in the higher meditations. When we apply the higher meditations to achieving mystical states, perhaps known only to ourselves, we are also striving, craving, and suffering. These are actually impediments to the calm and composed mind. When we meditate for its own sake with no goal in mind, simply out of devotion, that is best. A famous Zen koan is this. Jiaozhou asked Nanchuan, "What is the way?" Nanchuan said, "Ordinary mind is the way." Jiaozhou asked, "Then may I direct myself toward it or not?" Nanchuan said, "To turn toward it is to turn away from it." We've seen in previous videos the weight the Buddha put on community involvement in Buddhism, and in particular the importance of having admirable friends. There are a number of options in Western lands for encountering like-minded people, all of which can be quite wonderful, but whose appropriateness at any time depends on our current level of practice or what level of practice we aspire to. In the USA, we find basically 4 kinds of community organizations. First, meditation groups generally focus on a single practice with limited resources for those who wish to be involved holistically. Second, Western temples generally appeal to European Americans, however generally intent on achieving ethnic and racial diversity. These groups identify with particular Asian schools of Buddhism and are led by people with a degree of knowledge and experience. What is generally missing is a sangha. The third are Eastern temples, which generally serve as they generally serve a particular ethnic group of Asian origin. You might be surprised at how many of these there are in the most unexpected places in the USA. Eastern temples themselves fall into 2 categories relevant for our purposes. The first of these categories are Asian missionary temples, which seek to promote Buddhist practice and understanding to people outside of their core ethnic base. They're likely to have a bilingual sangha and offer some programs in English. And then there are Asian neighborhood temples. They're generally founded by local ethnic communities and are surprised but happy when somebody from outside that community shows up. I would imagine that Asian neighborhood temples represent the great bulk of American Buddhism. It's surprising how many Westerners who will go to on an expensive vacation to exotic lands will not venture into Eastern temples, where they're challenged by language, by culture, by peculiar devotional practices, and by unfamiliar statuary for free. Bear in mind that much of the religiosity is a later, albeit harmless, development. Still, this is typically where we find Buddhist life in its most complete holistic form. In particular, this is where the Sangha is fundamental. The importance of the monastic institution to Buddhism is evident in the significance the Buddha attached to it as he consistently referred to the entirety of his teachings as the doctrine and discipline, in reference to the monastic code laid down by the Buddha. Accordingly, Buddhist communities have faithfully and willingly upheld the Sangha throughout history in virtually every Buddhist land as a kind of social contract between monastic and lay. Remarkably, the Sangha is probably the most enduring institution on the planet, still following significantly the same discipline after 100 generations. The pure monastic Sangha functions as a kind of universal counterculture standing against many of the mainstream currents found in whatever culture it is embedded, and for the quite radical ancient values and social norms recommended by the Buddha. It even distinguishes itself in coiffure and apparel, much like beatniks, hippies, punks, and goths. It provides a reality check for the mainstream culture to the notion that personal excess leads to happiness. Each monk or nun serves as a very visible walking science experiment, a test tube in which the ingredients of the highest standards of Buddhist life have been poured and then stirred with results open for all to inspect. The Sangha provides the laity with the world's cheapest clergy, a rich source of admirable friends, a fertile field for making merit, and an abiding influence on the general culture. The Sangha also offers a unique opportunity for the most devout and engaged Buddhists. Membership secures the optimal social conditions, material support, and insulation from the kinds of vulnerabilities encountered in the midst in order to progress on the path to awakening. There was a time for me when monastic practice would have been a wild flight of fancy, but I discovered that it is quite doable even for a European American. And my practice and understanding have benefited enormously from this step. I would encourage readers not to dismiss monastic practice as a real option. A core function of the discipline is systematically to prohibit virtually every opportunity for seeking personal advantage, self-enhancement, or self-gratification. In this regard, it prohibits sexual relations and economic activity and tightly regulates ownership of property. It prohibits beautifying oneself or engaging in any normal livelihood or exchange. Monastics are not even allowed to purposely endear themselves to lay people with the aim of receiving better offerings of food and clothing. Since the monastic code allows one to do almost nothing for oneself, me has virtually no permitted function and easily loses its foothold, though it might continue for a time to haunt the mind. This kind of life would leave the monastic extremely vulnerable if it were not for entrusting their needs to the benevolence of the laity. In return, monastics require little, and while helpless with regard to themselves, they are have virtually no limits on what they can do for others. For the Westerner, joining the Sangha generally entails living in Asia or affiliating oneself with an Eastern temple in the West that supports the Sangha in the traditional way. This is because so few Western temples succeed in supporting a Sangha. Mindfulness is not a state of mind. It's something we do, we recollect. And it's something that has an object. We're mindful of something. That something ranges without limit in Buddhism over the entirety of the Dharma, over the entirety of the discipline, and by analogy can be used to bring the extra Buddhist externals of our life more or less in accord with the example of the Dharma. This, along with the specialized training in becoming more mindful, makes mindfulness very powerful in our lives. Moreover, mindfulness is, in a range of applications, is closely shadowed by mental composure, which is a state of mind, one that brings serenity and clarity and amplifies the power of mindfulness even further. It's important to bear in mind that Buddhism is eminently practical. Its natural roots are not in lofty philosophizing, but in real communities, in human interaction, in the practice of harmlessness, kindness, and generosity towards one another, in engagement in everyday affairs. The Buddhist thinking emerged from the nuts and bolts of practice realities in life, and it is here where mindfulness practice finds its place. It's important as we enter into Buddhist practice, perhaps a little at a time, to keep this all-inclusive perspective in mind. The Buddha's message was quite radical and continues to be radical when properly understood, both personally and socially. His message does not begin with transcending the human condition. It only ends there.